Welcome to episode 235, Behind the Masking, an intimate case study in recognizing autism in individuals assigned female at birth, featuring Patricia Young, Masters in Social Work. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes. By Clearly Clinical. Learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth Irias, and I am so happy to be joined again today by Patricia Young. Patricia joined us years ago for a conversation about working with highly sensitive people, and I am delighted to have her back today for a conversation about recognizing autism in people assigned female at birth and kind of the concepts about masking and how people navigate society that may make it a little bit harder for us as clinicians to recognize when a client has an autism diagnosis. Thank you so much for joining us again, Patricia.
Oh, thanks for having me, Elizabeth.
So why don't you take a moment and tell our listeners about yourself and your background, and then we will go ahead and dive on into this topic.
I was a licensed clinical social worker for 17 years. This last August, I just gave up my license. I'm doing online coaching full time. I learned about the trait of being a highly sensitive person, a deep thinker, deep feeler, deep processor, I don't know, maybe 5-6 years ago, and it really resonated with me. I created a podcast called Unapologetically Sensitive, where that was what my focus was. And then during COVID, while I was on TikTok, I saw a lot of content around autism. Late diagnosed, high masking autism and assigned female at birth. And I'm going to keep that my focus. It's not my intention to not include AMABs, assigned male at birth. This is just what I know about. And so if you fit into this, that's great. It really resonated with me. And for about 1.5 years, I sat with it. I self-diagnosed as autistic, and I still kept having doubts. Even today, I'm ADHD, autistic and ADHD. And when I look at the criteria for autism and ADHD, I do not see myself in it. I just don't, because the criteria was written years ago by white men observing white little boys who had very externalized observable behaviors. And even after getting diagnosed, I have this amazing coach who's a therapist also, who's also autistic ADHD with a PDA profile. We may talk about PDA later on, and RSD. And I said, I still have doubts about being autistic. I know I'm autistic. The reason why I'm sharing this with you is because I guarantee that you have clients that you are seeing that are autistic. And because we don't talk about, and many therapists, many assessors of autism, many psychiatrists still will think that if you're making eye contact, if you have a job, if you're not flapping your hands, that you can't be autistic. And we do a real big disservice to those folks that are seeing us when we use treatments that we're trying to get them to be neuronormative and they're neurodivergent. And I just feel really passionate about this.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us to talk about it. As we begin this conversation, let's start by unpacking and defining kind of some of the terms that you'll use today. You've already used a couple of acronyms. I'm sure there are more coming. As you and I talk about this, I want to let our listeners know we're going to be talking about assigned female at birth, so AFABs. And that can include a person who is trans, who's non-binary, can also include a person who identifies as a woman. And we use that term just as a note of inclusivity for the people who were born with internal reproductive organs. So AFAB, let's get that one taken care of. But let's dive into these other terms. What is masking?
If you are assigned female at birth, and you've made it past 20 and you haven't been diagnosed autistic and you may be autistic, you're high masking. And I think especially the way that females are trained, we're socialized to smile, to be polite, to think about others. My experiences, and I tend to have much more, my trauma response is much more of a people-pleasing response. And I think that that's one of the reasons why women tend to not get diagnosed, because we learn how to read. I don't know if it's accurate to say to read social cues, but we are attuned and we are reinforced to sit still, to do all the things so that you don't see anything externally. But internally, if you feel like your mind is going 100 miles an hour, we'll talk about ways that you may stim. We think of things that are obvious like hand flapping and rocking. And if you are a professional, that doesn't really serve you well. And if you're late diagnosed high masking, there are lots of ways that you can stim. It's interesting. I have the curly cord for my headphones and I'm playing with it quietly on my lap right now. I usually have cricket feet. I'm rubbing my feet back and forth. I will be rubbing a pen between my fingers. There are lots of ways I'll be using my finger on my leg, just rubbing back and forth, or rubbing my thumb and forefinger. I have lots of stealth ways of stimming that when I'm anxious, when I'm uncomfortable, it calms me. But unless you know to look for it, you're not even going to see it.
Thank you. And for folks who don't know what stimming refers to, what is stimming?
Stimming it can be internal, it can be thoughts, or it can be movements that help to regulate our nervous system. There's something that happens called synaptic pruning that if you're allistic, non-autistic, that as you're a child and you grow, these neural connections get kind of pruned off. And if you're autistic, it doesn't happen. So as an autistic, I process 40% more information than someone who's not autistic. That's overwhelming. That's things that I'm hearing, I'm seeing, I'm feeling. My nervous system is pretty sensitive. And stimming, so some of the forms of movement that I've talked to you about, it can be hair twirling, it can be biting on your cheek, it can be tapping your foot. Some of these things we recognize in ADHD. I am learning that I have some OCD, but I can remember as a kid doing lots of counting and even looking if I'm out in public, who's got glasses, who's got black shoes, like those are ways that I organize anxiety. I think those can also be ways of stimming. I also have, love the diagnosis, some pretty significant trauma and attachment injuries. And what I'm finding is that when these attachment injuries get activated, it really activates the heavy preoccupation with the relationship that I'm struggling with. So very obsessive thinking. And what I used to call deep processing, because I'm kind of new to this, like it probably is obsessive. So I want to be mindful in sharing with what stimming is, that what I may be sharing with you may be some of my own OCD, but thinking, processing, going over things, ruminating, those are other ways that we can stim. And I think that's one of the reasons why if you are a deep thinker and a deep feeler, so much of this is internalized and it's easy to miss and go like, well, I don't do those things. I don't struggle with relationships. I don't struggle with communication because we may have learned how to do it. But then there's this whole unmasking process of when we stop doing all, like I told you before we started talking, I've given myself permission to not make eye contact. When I talk, my thoughts are not, they're off in the top upper left-hand corner of my mind. And that's where I look a lot when I talk. I give myself to not make eye contact. That's unmasking, learning what it is that I'm thinking and feeling and needing that may not be socially acceptable. That's part of unmasking, being more authentic about who I am.
The acronyms. So we've already mentioned HSP, so that's highly sensitive person. You've talked about PDA. Can you talk about PDA? Because I think some people that have never heard this term in a clinical context think that we're talking about public displays of affection, when in fact we are not. So what is PDA from a clinical perspective?
PDA is pathological demand avoidance, which I don't like the name. It's not pathological. So in the autistic community, we call it pervasive drive for autonomy or persistent drive for autonomy. I call it, you're not the boss of me, but it's a need for autonomy. And and this can be perceived threats, it's a nervous system dysregulation. Again, when you see this in kids, it can look like very demanding, controlling, quote, rude behavior. It is literally nervous system dysregulation, and the child is trying to equalize this sense of not being equal with other people. If you're autistic, we don't see hierarchical relationships. Relationships are all equal. So for me, as someone with PDA, an example is I like to walk the dogs with my husband, but if I'm thinking I want to walk the dogs and he just tells me he's going to go, it's very hard for me to stop him. What I've asked is, 5 or 10 minutes before you're going to walk the dogs, can you just say, I'm going to be walking the dogs in 5 or 10 minutes? If he says, do you want to walk the dogs? That's a threat to my autonomy sometimes. But a neutral statement like, I'm going to walk the dog in 5 or 10 minutes, which gives me time to get my shoes on and get ready if I want to go. We can also have PDA around internal demands, showering, doing notes, clinical notes. And a lot of the times I have to really give myself permission to not do the thing because that sense of having demands activates my nervous system. if you are assigned female at birth, if you're high masking and you have a PDA profile, what this may look like is you're really good at anticipating other people's needs so that nobody makes demands on you. You may be very efficient. You may be very effective. You may be very attuned. And again, you're playing the role of a well-socialized female. And it's very easy for this. It's a lot to untangle. It's a lot to untangle.
When thinking about the management of PDA, what's the benefit to people who have autism of the example you just gave, of working with loved ones to say, here's this kind of warning, heads up, opt in, opt out, no pressure. What is the benefit for a person who has autism and how they're receiving and processing that information?
If they know their PDA?
Yes.
What is the benefit? I'll tell you, it can be challenging to live with someone with PDA. It just can be challenging. If you have a partner family that's able and willing to adjust how communication goes, I think it can make a lot of difference. And instead of telling people, why are you being this way? Why are you doing that? Using words like, I wonder, how is this for you? What's going to work for you? Really giving lots of freedom and autonomy. If you have kids, that's a whole other thing. And I don't think I want to talk too much about kids today because that's not my area of expertise. But giving people freedom and autonomy is going to draw them in closer, because if you're having this nervous system dysregulation, like my husband will often say, like, you can turn the TV on now. You can change the channel now. I've learned that this is just his language, but I don't like that. I'm like, you're not the boss of me. You can't tell me what to do. And if you have a partner or a family that talks in ways of telling you what you can or can't do, it's likely going to activate your nervous system. And then you're having to deal with a whole other set of dysregulation. Can we talk about language for a minute?
Yes, absolutely.
So for me, I don't see myself as having autism. I think of like when someone says you have autism, it's not like a suitcase that I can pick up and put down. It's who I am. I am autistic. There's a lot of talk in the community about a person with autism. If you talk to parents of autistic kids, they may have a whole different way of how they want to talk about it. What I would say is, for the person that you're dealing with, use the terminology that they use. It feels like in the autistic community, it's who we are. I can't put it down. I can't leave it. So for me, I am autistic. I have ADHD. So ADHD is an acronym for ADHD and autism.
Thank you. I appreciate you throwing that out there. And I'd love to also hear some of your feedback about the use of the word Asperger's by folks who identify with that diagnosis. Because I think this has had some kind of clinical controversy, if you will. And I'd love to hear your feedback on that, because I've certainly worked with people who say, I'm an Aspie. That's what I am. That's who I am. That's how I operate in the world. Can you speak to that a bit?
Honoring how people identify is what's really important. And it is nobody's right to go up to anybody and tell them that they're using the wrong term or they're identifying incorrectly. I think when Asperger's was a diagnosis, I think it's seen as kind of a autism light. And now we have autism spectrum disorder, ASD. I don't like that term because it's not a disorder. So for me, I just prefer autistic. People, I think, are really uncomfortable using the word autistic. So I hear people say on the spectrum. It's like we're not going to say it like cancer. Autistic. It's not, there's nothing negative about it. Hans Asperger was a Nazi who wanted to use eugenics. And so using the term Asperger's, Aspie, is not really positive. It's politically pretty, if you know someone who identifies as an Aspie, they have the right to do that. And I would never take that away from them. If you have a choice about your language and you're not with somebody who identifies as being an Aspie or Asperger's, we don't use that anymore. It's really not appropriate.
Thank you. I appreciate you addressing that. Other acronyms or other terms that you think are important for the foundation of this conversation today?
Well, there's RSD, rejection sensitive dysphoria, which is connected more to ADHD, but I suspect in the next 50 years, we're going to find out that there's a much bigger connection between ADHD and autism. I think the statistic is if you're autistic, I think it's 80% of autistics are also ADHD, and it's less going the other way, like maybe 40% of ADHDers are autistic. I don't understand how that works. My brain just can't wrap its head around that. I hear a lot of people talking about ADHD, and it sounds like autism. As an ADHDer, my autism is pretty much what drives the car. I tend to like structure, routine, sameness, order. I have a very close friend who is also ADHD, and her ADHD is what drives the car. So she has much more challenges with time and I don't want to say showing up, but much more. So you can hear the language that I'm wanting to, I want to use words like chaos and disorder, which are probably not neutral terms because I'm looking at it through my autistic lens. How you love me is you make times with me, you make commitments, we have plans, and she kind of flies by the seat of her pants. And again, you're going to hear the judgment in my language because it's not how I'm wired. So if you're ADHD, you may be more presenting, and I really didn't see her autism for a long time because the ADHD is so present.
One of the difficulties, as you pointed out earlier, with the diagnosis of autism and also ADHD is the sample that was used to create these diagnoses way back when. As you've mentioned, in the transition of terms of, what used to be Asperger's and then this spectrum of autism presenting behaviors, if you will. Can you speak more about why autism is sometimes so difficult to recognize in people who have been conditioned female?
Yeah. Well, if you look at the criteria for autism as it's written, it's a deficit model. It's all about deficits in communication, deficits, as opposed to looking at it through a neurocognitive model that we have brains that are wired differently and we have some amazing strengths. I just flew recently and I saw this thing on Instagram that said, the little boys who were fascinated with planes, maybe your pilot, those are the folks you want flying your plane because they know everything about flying in the planes because that is what their special interest is. Again, that is a very stereotypical idea that our special interests, like for me, it's relationships. It makes me a great therapist. So we can have special interests that are culturally very, quote, acceptable. It could be diet, health, fitness, nutrition, cooking, gardening. Think about the people that you know that are just passionate, that are your experts. I'm not saying all those people are autistic, but we think of being interested in trains and dinosaurs. So a lot of us go missed because it was based on observable behavior as opposed to all the other ways that it can present. And if you are late diagnosed high masking AFAB, your presentation is going to be very internalized. When I met with my coach, a week or so ago, I had a very, 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 very big mad in a very primary relationship. And I was relaying what had happened. And when I was done, and this was really upsetting, I lost sleep over. It was a really big deal. And she said, "How dysregulated are you?" I said, "I'm probably a 10 out of 10. She said, "I wouldn't know that because my presentation was so calm." I suspect that for me as a child, I dissociated a lot. I was hyperlexic. I read at an early age, had a great vocabulary, read like crazy, was very, very bright. I think reading was a way of escaping. It wasn't allowed in my family to have feelings, to express anger or to cry. I had to go to my room. And so I keep things buttoned up. It's very unusual for me to lose my cool, to lash out, to say unkind things. I have a very, very highly controlled, internalized profile. I think there are quite a few people that have the same profile. And so I was kind of shocked because I was so upset and she couldn't tell. And so I think that's a lot of what goes on. And the questions in a lot of the testing for assessing for autism are not about internalized perceptions. When we assess for depression and anxiety, there are questions that ask about our perception of how we're feeling. There's nothing like that with autism. It's very externalized, observable traits and not about our internal experience. And it's going to look different if you're late diagnosed high masking AFAB.
Before you and I started recording, I had shared in my own clinical work conversations with clients, adult clients about, what do you think about autism? Is that something that you've ever considered? And one of the consistent pieces I've heard is like, I just always thought that something was different about me. Can you speak to that piece a bit? Because I think that is almost like going back to what you just said about the internalized piece. It's like if you could modify the diagnosis information about autism to include some of that, like what would it have?
I'm still untangling this for myself, but I'm going to share what I've heard other people say is feeling like they're an alien, that something's always been different about them, and finally getting a diagnosis that makes sense. And there is this sense of not quite fitting in, not quite belonging, being on the periphery, like knowing what to do, but still never having quite that sense of fitting in. And I hear people say, like, I don't want a label. I don't want to get a diagnosis. I don't want to get my kid diagnosed. Your kid is going to get labels. It's just not going to be the accurate one. They're going to get, this is where I suck at coming up with examples, but lazy, inattentive, bossy, controlling, spacey, can't follow directions, can't sit still, doesn't play well with others. Those are about how the child is wired, and having an accurate diagnosis and interventions that are not to get the child to look more neuronormative, but to honor where they're at is really how we want to work with autistic children and our autistic clients. We don't really want, unless their goals are to be more neuronormative, we really want to embrace and meet people where they're at.
Is there any research about how often autism is diagnosed later in life among AFAB?
I'm not really great at this. I don't know. I think that more and more women are getting diagnosed, more and more AFABs are getting diagnosed. And then there's always this thing of, it's just a fad. Everybody's seeing it on TikTok. Everybody wants to be autistic. And like I said, I love that I'm autistic. I don't think anybody would consciously choose, like given the choice of being neurotypical or being autistic. I think they're probably neurotypical would be a lot easier.
When thinking about the standard course of autism in our culture, if you will, which is the third grade assigned male at birth kiddo who has ants in their pants and talks out of turn and doesn't make eye contact and might walk with a specific gait. We're looking at very specific behavioral and cognitive cues. Can you talk about some of those behavioral and cognitive cues of like, here is what you're looking for in a kiddo, and here's how it's different in an adult? Because I think what can happen is, maybe even a client comes in and says, I really wonder if I have autism. And then the therapist says, oh, well, you don't do XYZ, therefore you don't.
Yeah. I mean, here's the thing. If you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. I have a very specific profile of autism, and I've met lots of autistic people, and we present really differently. I think some of the myths and misconceptions is I can make eye contact. I have high empathy. I've been married for almost 27 years. I've had a very steady employment record. I'm verbal. I'm in touch with my feelings. Because I'm such a high internalizer, you're often not going to see what's going on. I've had lots of relationship problems. I went out on disability twice in my life, and I'm sure that, I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety, was on meds for those things. In retrospect, I'm convinced it was autistic burnout, which is not the same as regular burnout. There are so many misdiagnoses of borderline personality disorder, bipolar, anxiety, depression, OCD. And these things can be co-occurring, but because it's easy to get overstimulated, it's easy to have big feelings, big reactions to things, that you really have to keep an open mind in what you're looking at and not rule out and not be quick to judge what it is that you think you're seeing. So anxious kids, I was a kid that would remember all the details. Like I have a penchant for details. So I may be the kid that's reminding the teacher that it's time to do this, or you said we were going to do that. If you have a teacher that likes that, then that's great. If you have someone that finds that annoying, then there are times like people either really appreciate my skills or they find me incredibly annoying. That we have a great sense of justice sensitivity. We like sameness, routine, change can be difficult. Rules can be a really big thing. I was just, randomly thinking about the movie Polar Express and the kid who was kind of the know-it-all. Like, I'm not saying he's autistic, but that could be what you might spot in someone that's autistic. I was traveling recently with someone that I traveled with, but it's not like my personal friend. And while this person is very organized and very good at figuring things out, there was also like lots of extra information. Like, this is ableist of me. I'm going to say this is ableist of me to say, but lots of information, needing to have things a certain way, not thinking about what anybody else needed, that made it a little bit challenging. And I'm planning on talking to my coach about it, because I feel like these are qualities that I have that I'm seeing in somebody else. And I feel like it's ableist to feel upset about this, but it was really challenging to be around. So it could be people that just don't take your feelings into consideration, that look like they're being selfish. Sometimes autism can look like narcissism, very preoccupied, getting excited about things, talking about things, and not doing turn taking, lack of reciprocity.
I'm glad that you brought up the piece about high sensitivity and OCD. And I agree with you in your assertion that as time passes and we learn more, it seems to me that these things kind of cluster together and are potentially interrelated, and versions we'll see in the future, perhaps of the same thing, just different language we're using. You had mentioned autistic burnout. Can you speak a little bit about that and what typifies autistic burnout?
It's terrible. I'm not sure that I can articulate it very well. And I just went through a period of burnout. And it's interesting, my coach had asked about my room and was it a comfortable place? And I ended up getting a really lovely chair to have in there. And I got a really nice TV. And I had to ask, I said, is this because it's going to get really bad and I'm not going to leave my room? I think that we often take information and we make inferences without asking for what the information is. And she said, I don't think that's what's happening, but I want you to have a place that really feels nurturing and lovely for you to be in. It's not that I think that it's going to get awful, but I had no interest in anything. I was tired. The good thing is, because so much of my profile is about people pleasing and worrying so much about what it looks like to other people, that I was so burned out, I just didn't give an F. And there's something that's almost empowering when that happens, to get to that point where I just don't care if I don't save myself. I'm just not going to be able to get out of it. And I really didn't know how long it would take for me to get through this period of burnout. I think I cut down on clients. I don't think I stopped working altogether. But I just really could not do very much, lost interest in most things. But it wasn't depression. For me, I was still able to do a lot of my personal care, but just felt fried, like I had nothing to give and just felt really fried. I feel like somebody else could probably give a better description of what autistic burnout looks like. So take this with a grain of salt.
Going back to what you said earlier about the sensory processing piece as well, it's been my clinical experience in observing people who are experiencing autistic burnout that it's just kind of this sensory overload, just all systems powered down in order to protect from nervous system overload. When we are considering a diagnosis of autism in a child, we reach for some standard tools. Can you talk about what the standard diagnostic procedure is for autism in children and the special considerations for adults?
I think that they use the ADOS for children. And I heard recently of an adult taking an assessment and had to put blocks together and look at pictures and tell stories, which is really not helpful at all if you're an adult. I think the MIGDAS is a better tool. I've heard. I don't do autistic testing or assessments. I've also heard that some assessors will require that you get a partner, a friend, or a parent to give collateral information about your experiences, and that's not always possible. And often there's autism in the family, so the parent doesn't see anything that is, wrong with their child. Not wrong, but for lack of a better word. So sometimes parent reports are also not very helpful. And what I've seen, I had my own assessment. I've talked with some other people that when you are asked some questions and you can write a narrative about some of your childhood experiences, those may be helpful. I have a really hard time. Like, I was not a toe walker, and I had my twins assessed. I thought twin B was autistic. And when they were maybe, 3, I had them assessed for autism. They met all their developed milestones. They did not get diagnosed. Both of my boys were assessed with ADHD. Now we know that one of them is autistic. It wouldn't surprise me if the other one is, but I'm reluctant to share because I feel like this is their personal information. But I can tell you that one of them had, now we know there were meltdowns. He had meltdowns all the time. So when you have a sensitive nervous system and you get overwhelmed, you can have meltdowns, which are external, yelling, screaming, crying, throwing things, slamming, or shutdowns. And I'm a shutdown. I also, my trauma and my OCD created an eating disorder. It's not uncommon to have substance abuse issues because the sensory overwhelm and just dealing with things on a daily basis is so much. I mean, I think reading provided that also. It was a way to escape. So I tend to shut down. I would either use my eating disorder or I would read, or as an adult, I just kind of cave. I watch TV. So it's a more internalized presentation. It can look like depression. You know, I've started crocheting, which I love, and that is a great way for me to my brain stays busy. I can count stitches. I can watch TV. So that's something that could, every behavior is adaptive or maladaptive, and there's nothing wrong with any behavior, but, we need to look at the function that it's serving. So my kid had meltdowns constantly. I just didn't know what they were, and we thought it was ADHD. Now we know. So I'm sharing this with you because I had both of my kids evaluated. They hit all their developmental milestones. I hit all my developmental milestones. I don't recall hearing anything about me being a toe walker or not lacking empathy or any of those things, because I think we just don't understand as much of what that internal presentation looks like. And as a kid, my ADHD was much more present than the autism, but I think there was so much trauma there too and so much dissociation. I just know I was anxious. I didn't want to go to school. I cried a lot. I was very avoidant. I lied. I cheated. I sneaked. I stole food. That was how all this stuff got masked and covered up, because I knew how to behave and not get caught, but I was sneaky as all get out.
We know that girls, so assigned female at birth, under the age of 18 and usually even younger, much less likely to be diagnosed with autism, different presentation. Can you carry it forward when you have a 55-year-old person assigned female at birth? Like, what are your tells? Like, for you as someone who specializes in this, where you go, tell me more about that.
Well, I think it can be tricky in a couple ways. Like for me, I've been married for almost 27 years and I've been with my husband longer. So I'm confident there are lots of things in our relationship that my husband just accommodates for that I don't know it's an issue, because we just have a rhythm that's going. But I can tell you some of the things are, and I didn't know, if you go to a restaurant and you order something and you expect it to taste a certain way and it doesn't, that wanting sameness and being upset when things don't taste a certain way. Love information, learning, sharing. Oftentimes we'd like to ask a lot of questions because we want to understand, but that can be seen as challenging people. The need for routine, order, sameness, definitely that justice sensitivity, things needing to feel fair and equitable. You may have problems with challenges in maintaining employment, friendships, relationships, maybe felt different in the world, felt like you're on the fringes. You might feel more comfortable in one-on-one or small groups that have predictability and familiarity. Again, if you have ADHD, that may be different. You may be more extroverted. You may like more of the novelty, often needing alone time after being out in the world, that time to recharge. You may identify as an introvert. Susan Cain, who wrote the book Quiet, when I identified as an HSP, it felt like she was talking about HSPs. It wouldn't surprise me if some of that is autism too, needing that time to retreat. And we were traveling. We just got home the night before last. And yesterday I stayed in pajamas. I took a shower, but I stayed in pajamas all day. Like I just felt like my brain was just overstimulated, even though I got plenty of rest. It was an emotional trip, but I just needed a day to kind of unwind because it just was a lot. Traveling can be challenging for me. Like if I can get a direct flight, I get a direct flight. I keep earplugs on me as just a standard because things can just be too noisy. So being sensitive to bright lights, loud noises, sounds, crowds. I often think of the worst case scenario. I was thinking about wanting to go to Pride, and it's like crowds don't really, I think of a crowd and I'm like, no, thank you. Generally, we don't like small talk. There's certain things I love talking about, but if I'm talking with people, I get bored very easily. I want to go deep. I can make small talk and chit chat. And for people that I know, I love the intimate details of everyday life, but to do a lot of just chit chat, not super stimulating for me. I'm incredibly pedantic, accuracy. And I think oftentimes autistics look like they're trying to be right, but it's about accuracy and wanting to be correct, whether that's about spelling, grammar, facts, how things, details played out. That need for accuracy can be very, very strong. Oftentimes we do very great in school with rules and clear structure. So many times people that get PhDs, because the academic setting is very, very defined. It's not vague and ambiguous.
You had mentioned dissociation. Dissociation as a symptom sign, if you will, is much more common in adults who have autism. And of course, the reason for that, there are lots of postulations, but I think it builds on what you were saying about a shutdown versus a meltdown. When you encounter someone who you believe fits the profile, or I guess I should say, when clinicians encounter somebody that they think may be on the autism spectrum who is an adult, how do you recommend handling that for the reasons you said about kind of the concern about labels? That can feel like a minefield, especially for an adult. It's one thing when it's a kid and they're very much developing in their personality and trying on kind of different versions. There's a whole nother when you're an adult.
Identifying the behaviors and naming the behaviors, I think, is how we start laying the foundation. It looks like change is really hard. It looks like routines are really important. It looks like you get really upset when somebody doesn't follow the rules. So getting those behaviors that you're observing, and then it's hard because many of the people that have come to me identified as HSP, and I feel like I've had to tread lightly when I'm seeing signs of autism. I think it's okay to say, hey, have you considered autism before? Do you know much about autism? It presents very, very differently than what we know. And I'll be very honest with you. I do not really share that I'm autistic with very many people. I mean, there's kind of this dichotomy of anybody who listens to the podcast or follows me on social media. I'm like King Kong screaming from the top of the Empire State Building, I'm autistic, and these are all the things you need to know. But in my real life, I don't do that, mostly because it takes a lot of energy when people have concepts about autism, and I don't always want to have to dispel all those myths, or they have a nephew that's autistic or a child that's autistic and I can't be autistic and I don't look autistic, or they use terms that are, they just don't have the information. So there is this part of, I want people to really understand what autism looks like, and it's not a bad, dirty thing. And quite a few people that are there's nothing wrong with being autistic. We have amazing gifts to offer. And it comes with some stuff that's hard. There are things about my life that are just bleeping hard because of my autism. But I think that we can have those conversations. And if people, are resistant, then I think resistance is healthy. Resistance is normal. I tell all my clients resistance isn't a bad thing. And to try and uncover, what are your thoughts about what does it mean to be autistic? And it doesn't have to look this way.
You had mentioned previously kind of the use of different language. So adopting the language that a client uses. What are some other ways that practitioners can create more neurodivergent affirming practices? If
you're in person or online, not having your client make eye contact and to name that. I always, with clients, when I start working with them, if I say or do something like, I am going to miss a tune, and are you usually aware of it in the moment? Do you leave and you go like, what the heck just happened? To shoot me an email and say, hey, something happened in session and I want to talk to you about it, to really allow for that. Allow people to turn their camera off if you're online. Allow them to eat and drink during session, knit, crochet, use their Nintendo, play games on their phone. Those things are really self-regulating. If you have an in-office, have soft blankets, allow them to take their shoes off, have things for them to touch and to play with, cushions, pillows. Be very aware of sensory things, generally things that are not soft, scratchy, itchy, are not very appealing. Allow for neurodivergence. If the person needs extra reminders, if you have an EHR and you can, if they want to send extra reminders, because it's not uncommon to have forgetfulness, time agnosia, and to not be punitive and restrictive about things like that. Talk always about rupture and repair and attunement, because I'm going to jump back to something else. If you are neurodivergent, you have experienced trauma. Just the fact that you are wired differently, you will have trauma. And so that attunement and rupture and repair is so important. Our job is to create safety for the client, and we do that by modeling it. And so some of your clients will probably do better with mindful self-disclosure. One of the ways that neurodivergents show empathy is if you tell me about something that happened, I may share a similar story that shows that I have empathy. That often can be seen as being selfish, self-centering, and it's not. And so I often will ask clients, like, I have something to share. Would you like to hear? And I tell them, if my sharing things is not helpful to you, please let me know. But it's always with the intention that it's helpful for the client. And because of my podcast and because of how I show up as a clinician, I have clients tell me, like, they've never heard anybody else say that they struggle with these things or that they have these same issues. And again, we have these neuronormative ideas of how we think we're supposed to be in the world, and we never meet them. We may meet them for short periods of time. And if you have a clinician who's not neurodiverse-affirming, they may try and get you to meet those norms. And we're going to have fluctuations in our energy and how we show up, and being able to name that. Doing frequent check-ins, sharing similar stories, asking. I always ask how things land, and I'll say, I'm wondering. I never tell clients what I think they're feeling. I don't know. That's my PDA, letting the client be the owner of their experience. I'm wondering what do you think about this? And then I'll say, I have this story in my mind, or I'm wondering how did that land with you? What did I get wrong? Tell me what I missed. I'm always going to make the assumption that I am not getting things right, so I can empower the client to really own their story. Autonomy and consent. Do you want some feedback? Do you want me to listen? Really letting the client be the one that runs the therapy. And I tell people when I do an intake of, I don't know what you need and what's right for you. I'm a little bit more ahead of you on the path. I can be with you in this and I can help you learn and discover, but I don't have a crystal ball. And when people say, how many sessions will I need? Like, how do I know? I trust that you will know what you need. So really allowing the clients to have all kinds of autonomy in their experience.
Thank you. You had mentioned time agnosia. This is one that I've thought about as someone who's worked quite a bit with neurodivergent teens and adults. I'm curious your thoughts from a private practice management standpoint. Knowing that people who have autism have a lesser ability to necessarily understand time and manage time and sequence. Where does it land for you with like cancellation policies?
It's interesting. This just came up recently, and I've really loosened up with my cancellation. So my autism, the rule is, this is a rule, we follow the rule. That's my autism. And how I work as a clinician is really relational. And I've started to kind of slide, if you're looking at a binary line where the autism and the rule is on the right side and on the left side is we're just going to be very relational. I'm finding myself sliding much more to the left of it. I have one client who's ADHD and needs more reminders. And so I've set up extra reminders asking, is this what they want? And they have said that the extra reminders are helpful. I also feel like I don't want to be penalized for things that happen in life that I don't have control over. That doesn't feel fair to me. And I have a hard time taking time off of work. I know one time one of my kids was in town and we had a chance to go kayaking, and I decided, I think the day of, that I was going to cancel clients. And so I tell those clients that they get a free cancellation. But I think I'm really going to move more towards dropping my cancellation fee, because when I have the right fit of clients, I get very few cancellations. And I don't want my resentment to build up. But I think that when we look relationally, is it fair to expect somebody who struggles with time management to be able to show up on time? And are there things that I can do to create scaffolding and support so that they get what they want? Or do I want to swing to that far right where my autism is, if this is the rule and I don't really care about how you show up in the world and what you struggle with, but I want you to meet me where my rule is?
Thank you. I appreciate you addressing that question head on. As we're talking about how to make more neurodivergent affirming practices, I think your recommendation even just about more reminders, I think is a really valuable one. And many electronic health records now have that ability, and we can talk with our clients about that. And I also appreciate the guidance you gave about perhaps loosening some of the really rigid structure that has previously existed in therapy. And I can imagine how valuable and welcoming that could be for clients. When it comes to a later in life diagnosis of autism with a high masking AFAB, beyond just the initial, have you considered, I'm wondering, and referral, depending where you are, depending where you are and what kind of license you have, are you considered qualified to diagnose autism? Or is it something that may necessitate a referral to a different type of professional? What are other common services that you might reach for to help support somebody as they are working through this diagnosis and this new diagnosis for them of like this label? Like, what are some services that you find really helpful? So are you referring adults for occupational therapy? Like what? And I guess it obviously depends on what the client brings into the room and what they might want to be working on.
Yeah, it feels to me, I think occupational therapy is great. So I have no qualms with occupational therapy. It seems to me that the high masking, late diagnosed AFAB folks that I work with are managing pretty well. And more of it has to do with really understanding how their autism shows up and starting to normalize and seeing how the PDA shows up. I think if you have someone that's struggling, I don't think I've thought this through, so I'm just kind of pausing for a second. I think OT is fine. I think the biggest things are really getting more exposure to what autism looks like. I happen to be a great fan of TikTok. There's some great creators on Instagram too. That has been probably the most affirming thing that I have found for myself, is just seeing what the lived experience looks like. It's so validating and normalizing. And then I can remember thinking like, oh, that's an autism thing. Like I do that. Oh, that's an autism. Like I didn't know that other people were sensitive to those things. I didn't realize that. And finding communities where there are other autistic people. I think those have been the most beneficial things. There really aren't a tremendous amount of books. I know everybody suggests Unmasking Autism by Devin Price. It has some good information in it. I haven't been able to get through the book. I have it on Audible. I have the hard copy. I just can't seem to get through it. And so I don't have a ton of great resources, I think, which is probably why TikTok and Instagram seem to have some that's what resonates for me in my learning style. I think that's also where my ADHD shows up. I want quick, I want entertaining, and I want to be on to the next thing. Where I have another friend who's autistic. She loves hour-long YouTubes, and I'm like, ugh, it's too long. So it depends on, what part of your ADHD or autism is driving the car that day.
In this conversation with you, I've noticed that you have cultivated an awareness of self as part of your lived experience in the world, high sensitivity, autistic. Do you feel like that's one of the real benefits that we can offer to clients by being forthcoming and engaged in these conversations? It's just, I guess, the increase in insight and being able to understand ourselves.
So here's the thing. It's not uncommon for many people that are autistic to, because of that extra 40% of synapses, it takes longer to process information, that we're sorting and filtering through so much information. This is an area where I feel like my presentation is atypical, that I tend to be a pretty fast responder. I'm a verbal responder. I'm able to talk about what's going on. I'm not saying that I'm the only one, but I think that that's an atypical presentation. What I've heard from listeners that listen to the podcast are like, how do you know me? You're in my brain, like you are me. And that always feels it feels sacred, that in my willingness to be pretty darn vulnerable about the things that I struggle with, and I struggle with a lot of things, I struggle a lot, that I think it's helping people have a language. And I had somebody that I worked with, that one partner was autistic, and it really gave the couple language to work with. And so I feel like I'm providing a way for people to have language and understanding, but it's not uncommon for, if you're autistic, to be alexithymic, to not really know what you're thinking and feeling, to not have a lot of language. Again, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. But I think modeling, it can be very helpful. And I think that's why appropriate mindful self-disclosure can also be really, really helpful in the therapeutic relationship.
Thank you, Patricia. And for our listeners that may not know the origin or the word that Patricia just mentioned, alexithymic. So that's referring to difficulty recognizing and understanding feelings. And that is something that we commonly associate with autism. And as you pointed out, something that is very often socially massaged in masking. That it's like, oh, I'm supposed to feel this way, so I'm going to say the thing, and this is where I'm supposed to smile. like, and I am glad that you brought up that point as well. It sounds like a lot of the benefit you see is really just around normalization and sense of community, and that really human need to feel like we're part of something and seen.
Yeah, one of the things that we didn't talk about is, and I'm concerned I'm going to mix up my language, so I think I'm not going to use the terms, but it's not uncommon to not have a good sense of like, when am I hungry? When am I thirsty? When am I tired? And that all of a sudden I'll be hangry and I miss the signs that are coming up. And even with this attachment trauma that I've been working through, I'm finding that now I'm starting to see that when I start with the preoccupied thoughts, that's when the dysregulation starts. But I wasn't identifying it. So by the time I recognized that I was dysregulated, I was probably dysregulated like a 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10. We also can be really clumsy, bumping into things, not having a sense of where our body is in time and space. Those are some other things. And then there are a lot of comorbidities.
Those comorbidities, can you speak a little bit about that? Like we've talked a bit about like high sensitivity, ADHD, OCD, but certainly we see within the autism community, for example, a higher incidence of comorbid diabetes. Can you speak to some of those facts? And, you can't possibly name them all, but just so that our listeners can go, oh, that stands out.
Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, hypermobility, and we think of that as being super bendy, but as we age, we may actually not be super bendy because our muscles have had to work so tight because of the lack of collagen. POTS, which is postural orthostatic tachycardia, which means when you stand up and sit down and change positions, you often get dizzy, nauseous.
If we can for a moment, can we talk a little bit about the high masking, late diagnosis person in couple or family therapy?
You've got to have a clinician that ideally is autistic, that really is going to understand, because there's so much unawareness in trying to get your neurodivergent person to be more neurotypical and to not recognize how we work through these things. And I'll share something personal that I think relates to this. My co-host, I know we talk about it on the podcast. I'm doing this check, like, is it okay to talk about it? Oh, we talked about it on the podcast. My co-host, Jen, is very ADHD and I'm very autistic. And my attachment wound has been about Jen, that she started dating someone and it activated some trauma from my childhood of what happened when my mom would date, in that I'd be kind of the co-parent with my mom, and then she'd date somebody, and then I'd be relegated to child, and then she would stop dating him, and then I'd be back to, my status would change. And what happens with Jen, because of her ADHD, is she often gets just preoccupied with whatever's in front of her. And I end up, with my attachment wound, I end up feeling like I'm invisible, I'm left behind, I'm forgotten. And she tells me, just reach out and pull me back in. And often she'll think that she has communicated something with me, or I don't hear, like, we've been kind of going through some bumps with this new relationship that she's in because of my stuff. And I'll share something vulnerably with her on a Saturday. She calls me, I miss the call. Sunday morning, I'll wake up and say, hey, can we talk today, to circle back? Because she didn't respond and I was really vulnerable. And she'll say, yeah, I'll get back to you later on. And then a couple hours later, she'll let me know what's going on, but doesn't give me a time, because I want, like, I'll be free after this time so I can kind of identify that. And what happened a weekend ago was I went all day long kind of hanging on by my nails, and I started to get very, very, very dysregulated. And I came home and did some angry writing. And then she called, and it's the first time I've ever really gotten really, really big mad at her, like big mad. And part of what we had to untangle is we have different neurotypes as far as what we do. And she gets very preoccupied. And she's like, come into my world, call me, reach out to me, pull me back in. If I don't reach out before I get too dysregulated, I'm too into my narrative of I don't fit in, I don't belong, I don't matter. And then I get disempowered. This is how different neurotypes can really, you can struggle in relationships. And while we don't have a romantic relationship, we've really had to have some pretty honest communication about what do we do and how do we reach out? And because of my wound of being too much, I feel like and I have this monogamistic framework of our relationship that like her partner is above me. And so whenever she's with her partner, there's not room for me. There's not a place for me, or they go away and I have to withdraw for the weekend. So this is kind of a great example of how wounding, trauma, attachment styles, neurotypes, all of this can get mixed together. And if we were a couple and went to see a therapist who didn't understand this, it's very likely that we would both feel very negated, or the therapist might feel more identified with one of us than the other, or not understand all of this together. I feel like it's a good example and it's not a great example, but that's what I got.
Well, I appreciate the example because I think it illustrates those differences. And for couples and family therapists, it can't not be in the room if you have somebody who's neurodivergent. And as you said earlier, sometimes these traits or ways of being for someone who's autistic can be labeled incorrectly. You don't show up on time because you believe that your time is more valuable than mine.
Or I could be seen as being controlling or manipulative or demanding, or she could be seen as being evasive or irresponsible. And what we've talked about is we will have to live with this in our relationship because this is how we're wired, and having the ability to continue to discuss it and what it brings up for us is really what the goal is, as opposed to me getting her to be more in a way that regulates my nervous system or me accepting how she is. And we're both making different tweaks that seem to help, because there are things that she can do that help create a container so that my attachment wounds don't get activated. So this last weekend, I reached out because I was struggling, and she was with her partner. He was there for the weekend. And she said, I'll get back to you within 2 hours. And I'm like, so it's an ongoing process, but I think that these types of situations are very, very, very common in relationships.
Yeah. And it sounds like then for a clinician who has somebody in the room that they believe is neurodivergent, the importance of that psychoeducation and bringing the other members of that session ideally kind of into the conversation and what this person's nervous system might be going through, because we do so often approach things through a neurotypical lens without consideration for the programming, the wiring that might be different and how that can show up differently in the room. And I know in talking to couples therapists that this certainly comes up, that it's, in a case formulation of walking out of a session and then a couples therapist says, I really think that one of those people is autistic. And then it's like, well, how are you bringing that up? Like, what are you doing about that? Because it's probably such a significant part of the way that the people are relating to each other in that relationship. So I'm grateful for your example.
Yeah. And the meaning that gets attached to the behavior. If I were important, she would call me, she would hold me. And then also that sense of object permanence or lack of object permanence. If she holds me, but I feel like I get forgotten. And if we don't talk about what that meaning is, that's another layer that impacts the relationship.
Patricia, you have shared so openly and thoughtfully about your own experience and also kind of considerations for clinicians. Are there any particular resources that you find to be really helpful for clinicians that are supporting people who fall into this group?
Cascadia Training, I'm not sponsored by them, does a great training. B. Lorenko has a course that's called How to Be a Neurodivergent-affirming Clinician, I believe. It's great. Embrace Autism has a lot of self-tests on it if you're interested, if clients are interested. I will tell you that I took their PDA assessment and did not hit clinical significance, and yet I am PDA. So everything is not perfect. And I think had I taken their test before I thought I was autistic, I was so into being competent that I don't know if you can skew how you answer things. But those are two great resources. If you're thinking that you might be autistic, there's the Autistic Checklist by Samantha Kraft. Unmasking Autism by Devin Price. It's a decent book. I really like creators on TikTok and Instagram. I just think that lived experience is really helpful. I've talked a lot about the attachment injuries. If you want to hear about all the struggles that Jen and I have about my big mad, we've been talking about that and processing it pretty honestly on the podcast. If that's interesting to you, Unapologetically Sensitive.
Fantastic. And for people who want to learn more about you, Patricia, and your work, what's the best way to do that?
My website, unapologeticallysensitive.com.
Fantastic. It was lovely to have you again. And again, for our listeners, Patricia had previously joined us for a really interesting episode about sensory processing sensitivity, aka highly sensitive people. So I definitely encourage you to take a listen to that. Thank you so much for joining us today, Patricia.
No, thanks for having me.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive Continuing Ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need Continuing Ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our one-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of Continuing Ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.